Right then, said Hagrid, who seemed to have lost his thread. So you got your books, and now you need the magical creatures. So I'll go and get them. Hang on. He strode away from them into the forest and out of sight. God, this place has gone to the dogs, said Malfoy loudly. That oaf teaching classes. My father'll have a fit when I tell him. Shut up, Malfoy, Harry repeated. Careful, Potter. There's a Dementor behind you. Ooh! Squealed Lavender Brown, pointing toward the opposite side of the paddock. Trotting towards him were a dozen of the most bizarre creatures Harry had ever seen. They had the bodies, hind legs, and tails of horses, but the front legs, wings, and heads of what seemed to be giant eagles, with cruel, steel-colored beaks and large, brilliantly orange eyes. The talons on their front legs were half a foot long and deadly-looking. Each of these beasts had a thick leather collar around its neck, which was attached to a long chain, and the ends of all of these were held in the vast hands of Hagrid, who came jogging into the paddock behind the creatures. "Get up there!" he roared, shaking the chains and urging the creatures towards the fence where the class stood. Everyone drew back slightly as Hagrid reached them and tethered the creatures to the fence. "Hippogriffs!" Hagrid roared happily, waving a hand at them. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Harry could sort of see what Hagrid meant. Once you had got over the first shock of seeing something that was half horse, half bird, you started to appreciate the hippogriffs' gleaming coats, changing smoothly from feather to hair, each of them a different color. Stormy gray, bronze, a pinkish roan, gleaming chestnut, and inky black. "So," said Hagrid, rubbing his hands together and beaming around, "if you want to come a bit nearer—" No one seemed to want to. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, approached the fence cautiously. "Now, first thing you got to know about hippogriffs is they're proud," said Hagrid. "Easily offended, hippogriffs are. Don't never insult one, 'cause it might be the last thing you do." Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle weren't listening. They were talking in an undertone, and Harry had a nasty feeling they were plotting as to how to best disrupt the lesson. "You always wait for the hippogriff to make your first move," Hagrid continued. "It's polite, see? You walk toward him, and you bow, and you wait. And if he bows back, you're allowed to touch him. If he doesn't bow, then get away from him sharpish, 'cause those talons hurt." "Right. Who wants to go first?" Most of the class backed further away in answer. Even Harry, Ron, and Hermione had misgivings. The hippogriffs were tossing their fierce heads and flexing their powerful wings. They didn't seem to like being tethered like this. "No one," said Hagrid with a pleading look. "I'll do it," said Harry. There was an intake of breath from behind him, and both Lavender and Parvati whispered, "Oh no, Harry, remember your tea leaves." Harry ignored them. He climbed over the paddock fence. "Good man, Harry," roared Hagrid. "Right then, let's see how you get on with Buckbeak." He untied one of the chains, pulled the gray hippogriff away from his fellows, and slipped off his leather collar. The class on the other side of the paddock seemed to be holding its breath. Malfoy's eyes were narrowed maliciously. "Easy now, Harry," said Hagrid quietly. "You've got eye contact. Now, try not to blink. Hippogriffs don't trust you if you blink too much." Harry's eyes immediately began to water, but he didn't shut them. Buckbeak had turned his great, sharp head and was looking at Harry with one fierce orange eye. "That's it," said Hagrid. "That's it, Harry. Now bow." Harry didn't feel much like exposing the back of his neck to Buckbeak. But he did as he was told. He gave a short bow and then looked up. The hippogriff was still staring haughtily at him. It didn't move. "Ah," said Hagrid, sounding worried. "Right. Back away now, Harry. Easy does it." But then, to Harry's enormous surprise, the hippogriff suddenly bent its scaly front knees and sank into what was an unmistakable bow. "Well done, Harry," said Hagrid, ecstatic. "Right. You can touch him. Pat his beak. Go on." Feeling that a better reward would have been to back away, Harry moved slowly toward the hippogriff and reached out toward him. He patted the beak several times, and the hippogriff closed its eyes lazily as though enjoying it. The class broke into applause, all except for Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle, who were looking deeply disappointed. "Right then, Harry," said Hagrid. "I reckon you might let you ride him." This was more than Harry had bargained for. He was used to a broomstick, but he wasn't sure a hippogriff would be quite the same. "You climb up there, just behind the wing joint," said Hagrid, "and mind you don't pull any of his feathers out. He won't like that." Harry put his foot on top of Buckbeak's wing, and he hoisted himself onto his back. Buckbeak stood up. Harry wasn't sure where to hold on. Everything in front of him was covered in feathers. "Go on, then," roared Hagrid, slapping the hippogriff's hindquarters. Without warning, 12 foot of wings flapped open on either side of Harry, and he just had time to seize the hippogriff around the neck before he was soaring upwards. It was nothing like a broomstick, and Harry knew which one he preferred. The hippogriff's wings were beating uncomfortably on either side of him, catching him under his legs and making him feel he was about to be thrown off. The glossy feathers slipped under his fingers, and he didn't dare get a stronger grip. Instead of the smooth action of his Nimbus 2000, he now felt himself rocking backward and forward as the hindquarters of the hippogriff rose and fell with his wings. Buckbeak flew him once around the paddock and then headed back to the ground. This was the bit Harry had been dreading. He leaned back as the smooth neck lowered, feeling he was going to slip off over the beak, and then he felt a heavy thud as the 4 ill-assorted feet hit the ground, and just managed to hold on and push himself straight again. "Good work, Harry!" roared Hagrid as everyone except Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle cheered. "Okay, who else wants a go?" Emboldened by Harry's success, the rest of the class climbed cautiously into the paddock. Hagrid untied the hippogriffs one by one, and soon people were bowing nervously all over the paddock. Neville ran repeatedly backwards from his, which didn't seem to want to bend its knees. Ron and Hermione practiced on the chestnut, while Harry watched. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle had taken over Buckbeak. He had bowed to Malfoy, who was now patting his beak, looking disdainful. "This is very easy," Malfoy drawled, loud enough for Harry to hear him. "I knew it must have been if Potter could do it. I bet you're not dangerous at all, are you?" he said to the hippogriff. "Are you, you ugly great brute?" It happened in a flash of steely talons. Malfoy let out a high-pitched scream, and next moment Hagrid was wrestling Buckbeak back into his collar as he strained to get at Malfoy, who lay curled in the grass, blood blossoming over his robes. "I'm dying!" Malfoy yelled as the class panicked. "I'm dying! Look at me! It's killed me!" "You're not dying," said Hagrid, who'd gone very white. "Someone help me. Gotta get him out of here." Hermione ran to open the gate while Hagrid lifted Malfoy easily. As they passed, Harry saw that there was a long, deep gash in Malfoy's arm. Blood splattered the grass, and Hagrid ran with him up the slope toward the castle. Very shaken, the Care of Magical Creatures class followed at a walk. The Slytherins were all shouting about Hagrid. "They should sack him straight away," said Pansy Parkinson, who was in tears. "It was Malfoy's fault," snapped Dean Thomas. Crabbe and Goyle flexed their muscles threateningly. They all climbed the stone steps to the deserted entrance hall. "I'm going to see if he's okay," said Pansy, and they all watched her run up the marble staircase. The Slytherins, still muttering about Hagrid, headed away in the direction of their dungeon common room. Harry, Ron, and Hermione proceeded upstairs to the Gryffindor Tower. "You think he'll be all right?" said Hermione nervously. "Of course he will. Madame Pomfrey can mend cuts in about a second," said Harry, who had had far worse injuries mended magically by the matron. "That was a really bad thing to happen in Hagrid's first class, though, wasn't it?" said Ron, looking worried. "Trust Malfoy to mess things up for him." They were among the first to reach the great hall at dinner time, hoping to see Hagrid, but he wasn't there. "They wouldn't sack him, would they?" said Hermione anxiously, not touching her steak and kidney pudding. "They'd better not," said Ron, who wasn't eating either. Harry was watching the Slytherin table. A large group, including Crabbe and Goyle, were huddled together, deep in conversation. Harry was sure they were cooking up their own version of how Malfoy had got injured. "Well, you can't say it wasn't interesting first day back," said Ron gloomily. They went up to the crowded Gryffindor common room after dinner and tried to do the homework Professor McGonagall had set them, but all three of them kept breaking off and glancing out the tower window. "There's a light on in Hagrid's window," Harry said suddenly. Ron looked at his watch. "If we hurried, we could go down and see him. It's still quite early." "I don't know," said Hermione slowly, and Harry saw her glance at him. "I'm allowed to walk across the grounds," he said pointedly. "Sirius Black hasn't got past the Dementors here, has he?" So they put their things away and headed out of the portrait hole, glad not to meet anybody on their way to the front doors, as they weren't entirely sure they were supposed to be out. The grass was still wet and looked almost black in the twilight. When they reached Hagrid's hut, they knocked, and a voice growled, "Come in." Hagrid was sitting in his shirt-sleeves at a scrubbed wooden table, his boarhound Fang had his head in Hagrid's lap. One look told them that Hagrid had been drinking a lot. There was a pewter tankard almost as big as a bucket in front of him, and he seemed to be having difficulty in getting them into focus. "'Spect it's a record," he said thickly when he recognized them. "Don't reckon they've ever had a teacher who only lasted a day before." "You haven't been sacked, Hagrid," gasped Hermione. "Not yet," said Hagrid miserably, taking a huge gulp of whatever was in the tankard. "But it's only a matter of time, isn't it? After Malfoy?" "How is he?" said Ron, as they all sat down. "Wasn't serious, was it?" "Madame Pomfrey fixed him the best she could," said Hagrid dully, "but he's saying it's still agony, covered in bandages, moaning." "He's faking it," said Harry at once. "Madame Pomfrey can mend anything. She regrew half my bones last year. Trust Malfoy to milk it for all it's worth." "School governors have been told, of course," said Hagrid miserably. "They reckon I started too big. Should have left hippogriffs for later. Done flobberworms or summat. Just thought I'd make a good first lesson. It's all my fault." "It's all Malfoy's fault, Hagrid," said Hermione earnestly. "We're witnesses," said Harry. "You said hippogriffs attack if you insult them. It's Malfoy's problem he wasn't listening. We'll tell Dumbledore what really happened." "Yeah, don't worry, Hagrid. We'll back you up, said Ron. Tears leaked out of the crinkled corners of Hagrid's beetle-black eyes. He grabbed both Harry and Ron and pulled them into a bone-breaking hug. I think you've had enough to drink, Hagrid, said Hermione firmly. She took the tankard from the table and went outside to empty it. Maybe she's right, said Hagrid, letting go of Harry and Ron, who both staggered away, rubbing their ribs. Hagrid heaved himself out of his chair and followed Hermione unsteadily outside. They heard a loud splash. What's he done? Said Harry nervously, and Hermione came back in with the empty tankard. Stuck his head in the water barrel, said Hermione, putting the tankard away. Hagrid came back, his long hair and beard sopping wet, wiping water out of his eyes. That's better, he said, shaking his head like a dog and drenching them all. Listen, it was good of you to come down and see me. Hagrid stopped dead, staring at Harry as though he'd only realized he was there. What do you think you're doing, eh? He roared, so suddenly that they jumped a foot in the air. You're not to go wandering around after dark, Harry, and you two, letting him. Hagrid strode over to Harry, grabbed his arm, and pulled him to the door. Come on, Hagrid said angrily. I'm taking you back to the school, and don't you let me catch you walking down here to see me after dark again. I'm not worth that.